So as I mentioned in video 1 on book 1, The Republic is an awesome book that can enrich your life in many ways. And it's the foundation for much of Western philosophy, for most of the big ideas of philosophy are there in The Republic. And that's why Whitehead said something like all of philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. The focus of The Republic is on what is justice and why you should be just. Now, as I mentioned in the first video, many modern people think they know more about morality simply because they live in the modern period. But this is false. In fact, many modern people seem more confused about justice and morality than ever before. So I claim that every idea you have about morality has been thoroughly examined by Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle over 2,000 years ago, and the answers that they give are more profound, useful, and beneficial than most modern works. And this is one reason it's a classic. Now, if you watched the last video on Book 1, you'll remember there was much symbolism and drama, but Book 1 ends in Aporia, in Socrates claiming that he does not know what justice is or why one should be just. And so Book 2 begins with Socrates, Glaucon, and Adeimantus agreeing that they don't yet know what justice is or why one should be just. By the way, Glaucon and Adeimantus are young brothers, Plato's brothers, and they may one day rule the city, so it's important to get this right. Now, in Book 2, Glaucon and Adeimantus are going to build on Thrasymachus' cynical view of morality, and they're going to ask Socrates to refute this view. Socrates is being challenged to define justice and to defend it so that justice is not only good for the benefits it brings, but also good in itself. Now, these cynical arguments, by the way, are quite powerful, and I hear them all the time in the modern world. So, to start their case off, Glaucon and Adeimantus, they first present the story of the Ring of Gyges to defend a certain cynical view of justice or morality. As you think about this story, notice its influence on stories like The Lord of the Rings. So the Ring of Gyges is about a shepherd who goes down below the earth. That's always symbolic in the Republic, the going down. And he discovers a ring that makes him invisible. Now he uses the ring to unjustly gain wealth, power, and status by seducing the queen, killing the king, and taking over the kingdom. Notice the power of invisibility means you are taking away the body and looking only at the soul. And what dirty souls we have, according to Glaucon. His point is that people seem moral or just simply because they fear the self-interested consequences. People are just simply because they want to avoid the punishments of jail, a bad reputation, or a hellish afterlife. And they will be unjust if they can get away with it. So the cynical idea is that people value justice only as a means and not as an end. And so Socrates' job, and the central point of the Republic, is to prove that justice, like music and health, is good in itself and not good simply for its rewards, though there are rewards. And so, in Book 10, he's going to end it with a near-death experience. The Republic ends with a near-death experience where he argues that justice is also probably good for its afterlife rewards. Now, as you listen to this 3-minute excerpt of this part of the Republic where they're talking about the Ring of Gyges, it's helpful to think about what you would do with the ring. And when I ask my students, of course, it's a fun conversation, most would do something evil or mischievous, but some say they would destroy the ring, as Frodo accidentally does in The Lord of the Rings. And some would try to do good instead of evil with the ring. It's very interesting to explore. And what I would say as you listen to this is to keep this in mind. Perhaps the greatest power is to be like the one who wishes to destroy the ring. The power to resist that type of power. All right, let's take a listen for 3 minutes.
Having given both to the just and the unjust power to do what they will, let us watch and see whither desire will lead them. Then we shall discover in the very act the just and unjust man to be proceeding along the same road, following their interests, which all natures deem to be their good, and are only diverted into the path of justice by the force of law. The liberty which we are supposing may be most completely given to them in the form of such a power as is said to have been possessed by Gyges, the ancestor of Croesus the Lydian. According to the tradition, Gyges was a shepherd in the service of the king of Lydia. There was a great storm, and an earthquake made an opening in the earth at the place where he was feeding his flock. Amazed at the sight, he descended into the opening, where, among other marvels, he beheld a hollow brazen horse, having doors, at which he, stooping and looking in, saw a dead body of stature, as appeared to him, more than human, and having nothing on but a gold ring. This he took from the finger of the dead, and reascended. Now the shepherds met together according to custom, that they might send their monthly report about the flocks to the king. Into their assembly he came, having the ring on his finger. And as he was sitting among them, he chanced to turn the collet of the ring inside his hand, when instantly he became invisible to the rest of the company, and they began to speak of him as if he were no longer present. He was astonished at this, and again touching the ring, he turned the collet outwards and reappeared. He made several trials of the ring, and always with the same result. When he turned the collet inwards, he became invisible; when outwards, he reappeared. Whereupon he contrived to be chosen one of the messengers who was sent to the court, whereas, soon as he arrived, he seduced the queen, and with her help conspired against the king, and slew him, and took the kingdom. Suppose now that there were two such magic rings, and the just put on one of them, and the unjust the other. No man can be imagined to be of such an iron nature that he would stand fast in justice. No man would keep his hands off what was not his own, when he could safely take what he liked out of the market, or go into houses and lie with any one at his pleasure, or kill or release from prison whom he would, and in all respects be like God among men. Then the actions of the just would be as the actions of the unjust. They would both come at last to the same point. And this we may truly affirm to be a great proof that a man is just, not willingly, or because he thinks that justice is any good to him individually, but of necessity. For wherever any one thinks that he can safely be unjust, there he is unjust. For all men believe in their hearts that injustice is far more profitable to the individual than justice, and he who argues, as I have been supposing, will say that they are right. If you could imagine any one obtaining this power of becoming invisible, and never doing any wrong or touching what was another's, he would be thought by the lookers-on to be a most wretched idiot, although they would praise him to one another's faces, and keep up appearances with one another from a fear that they too might suffer injustice. Enough of this.
Okay, so Glaucon is trying to strengthen Thrasymachus's argument so that they are discussing a steel man instead of a straw man. And his point is that people are just simply because they fear the consequences, as illustrated in the Ring of Gyges. People are just simply because they want to avoid the punishments of jail or an afterlife, and they will be unjust if they can get away with it. Glaucon argues, in other words, that the just man would use the ring to do bad things because the just man is simply a lion with no claws. To quote Nietzsche later, just men are just only because they fear the consequences of getting caught. Okay, people want to fulfill all their desires, and they'll do it if they can, is the argument. And so the main problem of the Republic is being presented here. Can Socrates prove justice is good as an end and not simply as a means? Is justice good in itself in some sense, or do people seek to be just only to fulfill their desires, to earn rewards and avoid punishments? Now, at this point in the book 2 of the Republic, the argument doesn't stop there. It gets stronger. So they present the following. Glaucon compares the just man who appears to be unjust and suffers to the unjust man who appears just and prospers. Glaucon asks us to imagine that this just man who is thought unjust will be scourged and racked and bound, will have his eyes burnt out, and at last, after suffering every kind of evil, he will be impaled. Then this just man who appears unjust, this just man will understand that he ought to seem only and not be just, right? The unjust man, however, will prosper, live a long life. So we are to imagine this scenario and that there's no reward for being just, neither in this life or the afterlife. Would it not be better to be unjust and appear to be just, if that's the case? What is the point of being just if there's no rewards in this life or the afterlife? So Socrates must prove that even if there are no benefits and you are killed, being just is its own reward. Maybe it's like music, even if you're going to be killed. Imagine you never listened to music, but you could listen to it and hear it and experience it, but the price is you would be killed in a year or something. What would you do? Now, let's listen to them build this case for about 3 minutes, because it's such an important part of the Republic.
Now, if we are to form a real judgment of the life of the just and unjust, we must isolate them. There is no other way. And how is the isolation to be effected? I answer, let the unjust man be entirely unjust, and the just man entirely just. Nothing is to be taken away from either of them, and both are to be perfectly furnished for the work of their respective lives. First, let the unjust be like other distinguished masters of craft, like the skilful pilot or physician, who knows intuitively his own powers and keeps within their limits, and who, if he fails at any point, is able to recover himself. So let the unjust make his unjust attempts in the right way, and lie hidden if he means to be great in his injustice. He who is found out is nobody. For the highest reach of injustice is to be deemed just when you are not. Therefore I say that in the perfectly unjust man we must assume the most perfect injustice. There is to be no deduction, but we must allow him, while doing the most unjust acts, to have acquitted the greatest reputation for justice. If he have taken a false step, he must be able to recover himself. He must be one who can speak with effect, if any of his deeds come to light, and who can force his way where force is required, by his courage and strength, and command of money and friends. And at his side let us place the just man in his nobleness and simplicity, wishing, as Aeschylus says, to be and not to seem good. There must be no seeming, for if he seem to be just he will be honored and rewarded, and then we shall not know whether he is just for the sake of justice or for the sake of honors and rewards. Therefore let him be clothed in justice only, and have no other covering, and he must be imagined in a state of life the opposite of the former. Let him be the best of men, and let him be thought the worst. Then he will have been put to the proof, and we shall see whether he will be affected by the fear of infamy and its consequences. And let him continue thus to the hour of death, being just and seeming to be unjust. When both have reached the utmost extreme, the one of justice and the other of injustice, let judgment be given which of them is the happier of the two. Heavens, my dear Glaucon, I said, how energetically you polish them up for the decision, first one then the other, as if they were two statues. I do my best, he said. And now that we know what they are like, there is no difficulty in tracing out the sort of life which awaits either of them. This I will proceed to describe. But as you may think the description a little too coarse, I ask you to suppose, Socrates, that the words which follow are not mine. Let me put them into the mouths of the eulogists of injustice. They will tell you that the just man who is thought unjust will be scourged, racked, bound, will have his eyes burnt out, and at last, after suffering every kind of evil, he will be impaled. Then he will understand that he ought to seem only, and not to be just. The words of Aeschylus may be more truly spoken of the unjust than of the just, for the unjust is pursuing a reality. He does not live with a view to appearance. He wants to be really unjust, and not to seem only. His mind has a soil deep and fertile, out of which spring his prudent counsels. In the first place, he is thought just, and therefore bears rule in the city. He can marry whom he will, and give in marriage to whom he will. Also he can trade and deal where he likes, and always to his own advantage, because he has no misgivings about injustice. And at every contest, whether in public or private, he gets the better of his antagonists, and gains at their expense, and he is rich, and out of his gains he can benefit his friends and harm his enemies. Moreover, he can offer sacrifices, and dedicate gifts to the gods abundantly and magnificently, and can honor the gods or any man whom he wants to honor in a far better style than the just, and therefore he is likely to be dearer than they are to the gods. And thus, Socrates, gods and men are said to unite in making the life of the unjust better than the life of the just.
Okay, what a passage. And that was actually, 4 minutes. Okay. Now, they continue like this, and they go on and say, think about how religion and parents and teachers encourage us to be just. Usually it's to avoid punishment and get rewards, right? So you can read about that in there too. And so it just seems like justice is good for instrumental reasons. It's good because of the rewards and to avoid certain punishments. So there are three types of goods or values. One is intrinsic, sometimes called fundamental, and that's something that's good in itself. I mentioned music might be that for you, something that you enjoy for itself. You don't enjoy music to get money. You might get money to try to enjoy music. In addition to intrinsic goods, there's instrumental good, something that you value for its benefits, its rewards. Like money is usually an instrumental good because it can get you other things. And then you have goods that are both intrinsic and instrumental. And in this part of the book, they say, we want you, Socrates, to prove that justice is good in both ways, intrinsic and instrumental. It's good in itself and it's good for its benefits. And yet we have this case against it. It seems only good for its benefits, and our parents raise us that way. And so Socrates has a big challenge, and he takes it. Now, what he does next, what Socrates does next, is he argues that in order to understand what justice is at the individual level, the soul level, and in order to understand why justice is valuable in itself, we should first examine justice writ large at the larger level of the state. And then we'll more clearly see what justice is, and we can then return to the individual. So justice at the political level, according to Socrates, is going to be pretty much the same as justice at the individual level. Now, this assumption, political and individual justice are the same, is something that later Machiavelli, for example, will question, and perhaps some of you will. But I think Plato's point will still stand in the end. Okay, what Socrates does next is he discusses how the city will have specialization. Just like in your body, the heart has a special function, as do the kidneys and liver. So the state's going to have three classes of people. There's going to be specialization because the jack of all trades is master of none. Now, at first, by the way, Socrates paints the picture of a moral state, but then Glaucon objects because the state's too simple. It doesn't have fine foods and luxuries, and nobody could really live like that. He thought, okay, so he wants to paint the picture of a more luxurious state, and so Socrates follows along. So in this state, you're going to have philosopher kings who rule with reason. So that represents perhaps your mind, your intellect, your rule with reason, but it's a certain type of reason. It's awareness as well as what you might think of as discursive reason, intelligence. Now, you'll also have merchants you'll have merchants as in another group. They're the producers. They are the business people, the shoemakers, things like that. So we can call them merchants or artisans. And then the third group will be the guardians. Those are the soldiers who protect the land, and they extend the boundaries of the state so that people can satisfy these unnecessary, luxurious desires, right? And but they also defend. So the guardians are like the soldiers. So the question arises as to how to keep the guardians in check, how to keep them in check so they don't abuse their power. And Socrates' answer is they must be like philosophical dogs. And there's a little joke there. But a good dog, loves his owner, but he'll bark at strangers. May even attack them. And this is how we must raise our guardians, our soldiers. And he also starts talking about how to raise kids. Okay, and I'm going to play you a short little excerpt here because it's very important to get that right, obviously. How to raise the young to be guardians, to be the philosopher kings who rule, or to be great producers. Each of these young people need to understand their role in the city, their strengths and weaknesses and so on. So let's take a listen to some of this. I think you'll find it interesting.
Come, then, and let us pass a leisure hour in storytelling, and our story shall be the education of our heroes. By all means. And what shall be their education? Can we find a better than the traditional sort? And this has two divisions, gymnastic for the body and music for the soul. True. Shall we begin education with music and go on to gymnastics afterwards? By all means. And when you speak of music, do you include literature or not? I do. And literature may be either true or false? Yes. And the young shall be trained in both kinds, and we begin with the false? I do not understand your meaning, he said. You know, I said, that we begin by telling children stories which, though not wholly destitute of truth, are in the main fictitious, and these stories are told them when they are not of an age to learn gymnastics. Very true. That was my meaning when I said that we must teach music before gymnastics. Quite right, he said. You know also that the beginning is the most important part of any work, especially in the case of a young and tender thing, for that is the time at which the character is being formed, and the desired impression is more readily taken. Quite true. And shall we just carelessly allow children to hear any casual tales which may be devised by casual persons, and to receive into their minds ideas for the most part the very opposite of those which we should wish them to have when they are grown up? We cannot. Then the first thing would be to establish a censorship of the writers of fiction, and let the censors receive any tale of fiction which is good, and reject the bad. And we will desire mothers and nurses to tell their children the authorized ones only. Let them fashion the mind with such tales, even more fondly than they mould the body with their hands, but most of those which are now in use must be discarded. Of what tales are you speaking? He said. You may find a model of the lesser in the greater, I said, for they are necessarily of the same type, and there is the same spirit in both of them. Very likely, he replied, but I do not as yet know what you would term the greater. Those, I said, which are narrated by Homer and Hesiod, and the rest of the poets, which have ever been the great story-tellers of mankind. But which stories do you mean? He said, and what fault do you find with them? A fault which is most serious, I said, the fault of telling a lie, and what is more, a bad lie. But when is this fault committed? Whenever an erroneous representation is made of the nature of gods and heroes, as when a painter paints a portrait not having the shadow of a likeness to the original. Yes, he said, that sort of thing is certainly very blamable. But what are the stories which you mean? Well, first of all, I said, there was that greatest of all lies in high places which the poet told to Uranus, which was a bad lie too. I mean what Hesiod says that Uranus did, and how Cronus retaliated on him. The doings of Cronus and the sufferings which in turn his son inflicted upon him, even if they were true, ought certainly not to be lightly told to young and thoughtless persons. If possible, they had better be buried in silence. But if there is an absolute necessity for their mention, a chosen few might hear them in a mystery, and they should sacrifice not a common pig, but some huge and unprocurable victim, and then the numbers of the hearers will be very few indeed. Why, yes, said he, those stories are extremely objectionable.
Okay, so what's happening here is Socrates is attacking Homer and the stories in which the gods engage in evils like rape, lust, and so on. He argues that we should censor these stories and music that are young guardians here so that only good things come from the gods. And he has some very interesting arguments about what sorts of things should come from God or the gods. Now, you may think censorship is bad, and I agree with you for the most part, but when it comes to my children, I certainly censor for them. I don't let them watch, listen, or read just anything. There's a lot of garbage out there that will lead to bad habits of mind, emotions, and body. Now, of course, that's quite different than letting some government ruler censor for my children, right? But what we're going to do here is in Book 2, because in Book 3, he's going to develop these arguments in more depth about what to censor and why censor it, how to raise the young, and what this political state or city will look like, the ideal one. Because remember, what he's trying to do is to show what justice is in the state. It's this sort of harmony of the three classes of people, and then apply that to the individual. Thanks.